I write when I have something to say. And that can be, for example, the book Basic Economics that I wrote, that took shape over a period of a decade. I wasn't even sure when it would be finished. But as I would see things written that on TV that were actually just so wrong economically, I would then sit down and write something explaining this thing in plain language. Earlier, Dan Rather had a broadcast in '93, if I remember correctly, where he said that 1 out of 8 children in America was going to bed hungry tonight. And I went back and looked up the original study. I mean, there's few things more disillusioning than looking up original studies. And it was utter nonsense from that study. The study wasn't that great itself, but to conclude that 1 out of 8 kids in this country are going to bed hungry at night, when in fact obesity is higher in the lower income brackets than in the higher brackets, was just madness. I hear people say, I don't understand why this company CEO makes all this money. The government should do something about it. Or they say, the pharmaceutical companies spend more on advertising than on research, and the government should stop that. And I remember writing back to one of these guys and saying, what facts do you have? What expertise do you have? What anything do you have that enables you to say how much advertising and how much research somebody else should be doing in a field that you have no knowledge of? But I think it's one of the sad signs, I think, of our educational system. We have people who really don't know very much about anything, who nevertheless feel entitled to, as I say, I have a right to my opinion. Well, I wouldn't deny them that. It's just that they think that the government has a duty to make their opinion law. We've reached a point where there are great numbers of people who don't argue in terms of what your facts are. They argue, well, that your motivation must be wrong. You lack compassion for the poor, et cetera, et cetera. The Democrats get something like 80 to 90% of the black vote. If that ever falls down to 60 or 70%, they're in deep trouble because they've alienated so many other people that they have a hard time winning elections at all. And so therefore they must try to keep blacks paranoid. In 1899, there was a black high school in Washington which scored higher on mental tests than 2 of the 3 white high schools. Dunbar. And 100 years later, it would be considered utopian to even set that as a goal. And the question is, how did this happen? Why did it happen? And why is there so little interest in it? And the latter especially just is very troubling, because I first began writing about Dunbar 30-some years ago because people were saying how terrible the education of black kids was. And the question is, well, what can we do? And the answer, I said, well, black kids have already been educated successfully. We don't have to speculate and come up with esoteric theories and so on. And I published this, and I found that there was virtually no interest among educators or politicians or intellectuals. And the few who took any interest at all were concerned to discredit what was said because it went so completely counter to what they already believed. People from time to time ask me to mention some black conservative writers. And I tell them, 30 years ago, I could have told you Walter Williams and me. And today, I can't even keep track of them all. They're all over the place. They're in the media. They have their own shows. They write columns. They write books. And I learn about them, from nowhere. They suddenly appear. So there is this counter trend going on, and everything depends upon which wins out in the end. The slavery was much bigger and involved infinitely more people than people have realized. It was not confined by race. It was not defined by race or created by race. It existed for thousands of years. A history professor had a student come up to him and ask him, well, when did slavery begin? He said, you're asking the wrong question. The question is, when did freedom begin? Because slavery existed as long as we have any records. And from archaeological finds, we realize that people were enslaving other people before they could read and write. So that's always existed, and it's existed all over the world. The number of white people enslaved by pirates in North Africa was greater than the number of Africans brought to the United States. And yet that's not even mentioned in most of the discussion. So I tried to look at slavery as a worldwide phenomenon, and it's something that's lasted for thousands of years. And I also tried to ask the question, why did it end? It ended here because of a civil war, but it didn't end anywhere else because of that. It took over 100 years to root it out. And again, the literature, there's tons. You can find the shelves groaning with books about the United States, the Western Hemisphere, and Africans, but virtually nothing about the rest of it. This book about the Europeans enslaved by North African pirates came out in 2003. By 2004, you couldn't find a copy. For all practical purposes, going out of print. There was just no interest in it. Racism in the United States grew out of slavery, but slavery didn't grow out of racism. The Europeans enslaved other Europeans for centuries before the first African was ever brought to the Western Hemisphere. That wherever there were people that were vulnerable for whatever reason, those were the people that were preyed upon. Even though for most of history, those who enslaved and those who were slaves were the same race. It's a fascinating story because among the middleman minorities, of which the Jews are the most prominent, the hostility of these people in countries around the world is out of all proportion to that, to any other kind of group I can think of. In terms of violence, the number of Chinese killed, let's say, in 1 year, and by mob action exceeds all the blacks lynched in the entire history of the United States. And the number of Armenians killed in Turkey, during the First World War is greater than that. And of course, the number of Jews slaughtered on a number of occasions in history, even before the Holocaust, is greater than that. So that the question is, why this particular kind of people are the targets of so much venomous hatred? And I think the answer is that they not only succeed, they succeed in a way which is a threat to the egos of other people. That is, you can envy a Rockefeller, but he's no threat to your ego because you say, listen, anybody can be rich if he's born a Rockefeller. But the guy who comes here, let's say from Vietnam or Korea, and arrives here with little more than the clothes on his back and a few words of broken English, and a decade later he has his own little business, and you see his son a few years after that getting ready to go off to Harvard or MIT, you got to ask yourself, you either got to, you've got to hate yourself for saying, my God, I've been stagnating. This guy was nothing, and now he's risen up. Or you're going to have to hate him. And most people, when they have a choice between hating others and hating themselves, they hate others. Years ago, one official of one of the Jewish organizations in New York asked me, what can Jews themselves do in order to minimize the hostility they face? And I gave him a one-word answer: fail. Because as long as you succeed, you're going to be hated. The role they play economically has never been understood. They're middlemen or they're money lenders, and the argument is they really aren't producing anything. You can't see anything tangible that they don't stand at a production line turning out widgets. And so the argument is that they're not producing anything. They're simply gratuitously inserting themselves between the producer and the consumer, and they're parasites, essentially. And this argument has been made, again, not only about the Jews, but about similar groups around the world. And in a number of places, they have expelled those people, or forced them out by mob actions, forced them to flee. And after they left, the economy has collapsed. But it never teaches the lesson that, no, they were doing something. The Germans were not more racist than other people. All the evidence that I was able to find was that, in general, they tended to be less racist, not only towards Jews, but towards blacks in the United States, towards the American Indians, and towards the Aborigines in Australia. And the really chilling conclusion I draw from that is, if what happened in Germany could happen among Germans, it could happen anywhere, and none of us should feel safe. Once you start with a certain conception of human beings, an awful lot of other things follow when you talk about justice, about power, about equality, about all sorts of other things, depending on what's your assumption about the nature of man.